Vienna, 1906. Just as frost crept over the cobblestones outside Schönbrunn Palace's eastern wing, a scream echoed from the Empress's private chambers, and everything changed. Ziven Thorne, a palace guard barely a year into his post, froze mid-step. He had been patrolling the marble corridor between the conservatory and the nursery wing, his rifle slung dutifully over his shoulder, when the cry shattered the stillness. It wasn't panic, it was pain, and it came from behind a door he was never meant to approach. He hesitated only a second. Then, with a grin set to his jaw, he pushed through the gilded doors. Inside, two midwives hovered over a young woman lying in a sweat-soaked bed. Her lips were pressed thin, her skin ghostly pale under the candlelight. The Empress Josepha of House Habsburg gripped the sheets with white knuckles, her breath shallow. A sleeping potion sat untouched on the side table. "Get out," one attendant gasped. "You're not allowed." But Josepha's voice cut through them all. "Stay." Ziven did not move. His eyes locked with hers. She was only 20, younger than he had expected. Her long, dark hair clung to her temples, and in her arms, wrapped hastily in a linen cloth, was a newborn boy with a full head of dark curls. "Take him," she whispered. "Now. Hide him." The midwives exchanged fearful glances, but no one dared reach for the child. Ziven stepped forward. "You don't understand," Josepha said, voice trembling. "If my uncle finds out, he'll exile the boy. Or worse." Ziven's throat tightened. He'd heard the rumors. The Empress had been widowed 6 months after her coronation. No heir, no consort. No one had seen her receive visitors, not even foreign dignitaries. And yet this child. He cradled the tiny boy gently. The baby let out a soft sigh and curled his fingers around a button on Ziven's uniform. "His name is Rian," Josepha said, eyes filling. "No one must know he's mine." Ziven didn't ask questions. He gave a sharp nod, turned, and disappeared into the servants' corridors before the wet nurse even reached the door. By morning, the palace buzzed with rumors. A scream in the night. A sudden illness. The Empress confined to her chambers. But nothing about a child. Nothing about a guard vanishing from his post for nearly an hour. Ziven had taken Rian to the only place he could trust, an old family friend, a retired governess named Frau Engel, who lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of Vienna. She asked no questions when she saw the wrapped bundle. "The child of a queen," she murmured, her voice soft. "God help us all." Back at the palace, Ziven resumed his duties without a word. His hands carried the scent of lavender soap for days after bathing the boy. His chest still ached with the weight of the Empress's plea. He didn't see her again until 3 weeks later. It was snowing lightly when he was posted at the North Gallery, just outside the Empress's private library. Few guards were ever stationed there. It was considered a quiet wing, rarely visited. But that day, the door opened. Josepha stepped out, cloaked in midnight blue, her face partially obscured by a woolen scarf. She paused, eyes finding him instantly. "You kept your word," she said softly. Ziven stood straighter. "Yes, Your Majesty." Her gaze didn't waver. "Is he safe?" "He is. He's warm, fed, and laughing. He laughs often." Josepha's lips parted slightly. "A breath. A memory." "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His heart felt too big for his chest. She turned to go, then paused. "Walk with me." They strolled through the long gallery, boots thudding softly on the carpet. Her fingers brushed the carved trim of the portrait frames. His hand stayed by his side, but every step beside her felt like a stolen moment. "I wasn't foolish," she said after a time. "I knew what I risked, but I didn't expect to love him so terribly, or to fear what that love might cost." Ziven looked at her, surprised by her honesty. She stopped, turning toward a window where frost traced the glass. "You didn't ask who his father is." "I don't need to know." She smiled faintly. "You're the first man who's ever said that to me." He shifted his weight. "I'm not here to judge you, Your Majesty, just to protect what matters." Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, respect, sorrow, something sharper beneath. From then on, she found reasons to walk that gallery. Sometimes she asked about Rian, what he liked to eat, whether he slept through the night, if he had started teething. Other times, she said nothing at all. They would walk in silence, the hush between them more sincere than words. Winter turned to spring. The palace gardens bloomed. The Empress laughed once at something Ziven said about Rian trying to eat a candle. And Ziven, who had never heard her laugh before, thought it was the finest sound in Austria. But there was danger, still. Archduke Leopold, her uncle and regent in all but name, had grown suspicious. He questioned her frequent absences, her odd requests for privacy, her sudden interest in a particular guard's patrol schedule. One evening, Josepha found Ziven in the library, sorting through a stack of letters he wasn't supposed to touch. She closed the door behind her. "You need to leave Vienna," she said, voice low. "Tonight." He rose. "What happened?" "They're watching you. Leopold's men. A tutor of mine, he warned me." He intercepted a letter. "They think you're involved with me." "I am," he said without hesitation. The word surprised them both. She looked away, then back. "Ziven." He took a step closer. "Say it." "I can't," she whispered. But she didn't move when he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away when his gloved fingers enclosed hers. "I'll go," he said. "But I'm taking you and Rian with me." A pause. Then a tear slipped down her cheek. "There's a way," she said slowly. "An old hunting estate my father gave me before he died. It's in Styria. Remote. Forgotten. When? Tomorrow. At dusk." He nodded. And for the first time, she leaned into him just for a second. Her forehead brushed his chest. His hand rested between her shoulder blades. It was not a kiss, but it was a promise. Neither of them knew it yet, but the next 24 hours would decide everything: freedom, love, and the life of a hidden heir to the empire. The rain came early the next evening, thin and steady, sheeting across the carriage windows as Josepha sat in the shadows with her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a dark traveling cloak, the hood drawn low, and a veil that concealed the finer details of her face. Beside her, Frau Engel held Rian beneath a thick woolen blanket, his small mouth parted in sleep. He made no sound as the wheels turned over wet cobblestone. Ziven sat opposite them, his uniform traded for a coarse wool coat, and a worn cap pulled low. He had not spoken since they left the hidden courtyard behind the kitchens, where a sympathetic servant had left the carriage unguarded for barely 10 minutes. That was all the time they'd had to disappear. "You've driven before?" Josepha asked, her voice low enough not to wake the child. "Only carts," he said. "But it's downhill until the forest road." She nodded once, then leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. Her shoulders never fully relaxed. The city faded behind them, replaced by farmland, then sparse woodland. The further they traveled, the clearer the air became. The scent of wet pine crept through the cracks in the window and mingled with the faint sweetness of the child's breath. It was nearly midnight when they reached the outer edge of the estate. The old iron gate stood half open, the top half of one hinge rusted through. Ziven dismounted and pushed it wide enough for the carriage to pass. No one had disturbed the grounds in years. Brambles climbed the once pruned hedgerows, and the gravel path was half swallowed by moss. The manor itself was modest by imperial standards: 2 floors, stone foundation, steep roof, and shuttered windows that bore the weight of long neglect. But it stood, and the roof held. Inside, the air was stale but dry. They lit no lamps at first. Ziven found a stash of firewood in a shed behind the kitchen and built a low flame in the hearth. The light flickered against the stone walls, revealing dust-covered furniture beneath linen sheets. Josepha carried Rian to the 2nd floor, choosing a room with faded tapestries of hunting stags and snow-covered furs. She laid him in a cradle Frau Engel had brought along, hand-carved and passed down through her family. The child did not stir. When she returned downstairs, Ziven was crouched near the hearth, his back to her, warming his hands. She paused in the doorway, watching him. "You didn't have to come this far," she said eventually. He turned his head. "You never asked me to." She stepped closer, the firelight catching the edge of her veil. "Would you have stayed if I had?" He stood slowly, brushing the soot from his palms. "Yes." They were quiet for a long stretch. The wind pressed against the shutters, but the walls held. "You once told me you were from Moravia," she said, settling into a chair near the fire. "Near Olomouc. My father was a cooper. We lost him to the fever when I was 9. She watched the flames lick at the logs. "And your mother?" "Was too proud to remarry. Worked for a countess. I joined the army to keep food on the table." Josepha nodded, but didn't speak. Her gloves were damp. She peeled them off, finger by finger, and set them on the hearthstone to dry. "I haven't spoken to anyone like this in years," she admitted. "Not without calculating what every word might cost." Ziven leaned against the mantel, arms crossed. You can stop calculating now. She looked up at him, and something in her eyes shifted uncertainty, perhaps, or the slow realization that hope was not a solitary thing. I don't know how to be anything but careful, she said. I don't need you to be anything but real. Josepha's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the ache of unfamiliar honesty. She stood and walked past him, toward a window that overlooked the orchard. The trees were bare, their limbs black against the moonlight. There's still danger, she said, her voice quieter now. Leopold won't stop. He needs the throne secured before the next council. I can't stop him, Ziven said, but I can keep you out of his reach. She turned to face him fully. And if he comes here, then we don't stay. There was no bravado in his tone, just certainty. Josepha looked toward the stairs. I was raised to give orders, to survive by controlling every outcome. But with Rian, I couldn't control anything. I only knew I had to keep him safe, even if it meant becoming invisible. You don't have to disappear, Ziven said. She stepped toward him, slow and deliberate. What do I do instead? His voice was steady. Live. Her hand brushed his, lightly, the barest touch of skin to skin. He didn't move. Neither did she. I don't even know what that means, she whispered. We'll find out, he said. Outside, the rain had stopped. The wind softened. In the cradle upstairs, Rian shifted in sleep, his fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. They stood together in silence. There were no declarations. Only the warmth of the fire, the scent of pine smoke, and the quiet understanding that something fragile and new had begun to grow between them, not out of passion or desperation, but out of shared risk and the will to protect what neither could bear to lose. By late April, the estate had begun to yield to their presence. The shutters no longer groaned in protest when opened, and the earth near the kitchen garden had softened enough for Frau Engel to coax early shoots of radish and spinach from the soil. Wind still haunted the ridge above the orchard, but the house itself had settled into a hush that felt less like abandonment and more like waiting. Josepha stood barefoot in the music room, its windows newly scrubbed and thrown wide to the pale afternoon light. Her fingers hovered above the keys of an aging forte piano, its surface dulled by years of dust. When she pressed down, the note was uneven, but true. She played a short passage from a sonata she had not touched since her girlhood, a piece her tutor used to make her repeat until her wrists ached. Ziven leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching her with quiet attention. He had spent the morning repairing the broken latch on the stable door, his sleeves still streaked with sawdust and oil. I didn't expect you to know Mozart, he said, his voice low but without surprise. I don't, she said without turning. Not properly. I only remember what my hands refused to forget. Ziven stepped into the room, his boots quiet on the rug. You play like someone who learned to be heard without speaking. She looked over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. When I was a girl, my mother said a woman should never need to raise her voice. That elegance was control without effort. Was that true for her? Josepha returned her gaze to the keys. She controlled everything. Until a fever took her in 3 days. Ziven said nothing at first. The silence between them lengthened, filled only by the wind rustling the trees beyond the windows. You ever miss that world? He asked eventually. I miss the dignity of order, she said, lifting her hands from the keys. Not the coldness of it. He nodded once. Then, after a pause, Rian starting to crawl. Josepha's face softened. Already. He made it halfway across Engel's rug this morning before he gave up and fell asleep beside the stove. She smiled, but it was fleeting. He'll outgrow this place. Then we'll find another, Ziven said. Josepha stood, crossing the room to the bookshelf. Her fingers trailed along cracked spines, histories of the empire, botanical journals, a volume of poetry by Schiller with a pressed violet between its pages. You say we so easily, she said. Because I mean it. She turned to face him. What are we, Ziven? His jaw tensed, not from hesitation, but from the weight of the question. He stepped forward, slowly, until barely a pace remained between them. I'm the man who will never ask you to be less than what you are, he said. And you're the woman I would follow anywhere, not because you command it, but because I want to. Josepha's breath caught, but she did not look away. I was raised to belong to Austria, she said. Not to myself. Not to anyone else. Then let this be the first thing that belongs to you freely. Her hands curled slightly at her sides, the only sign of the storm behind her stillness. "What if we're found?" she asked. "What if Leopold arrives with 20 men, a signature from the council, and a priest to declare me unfit? Then I'll put you on a horse and ride until there's no road left. And if I refuse to run again, then I'll stand beside you and face what comes." She drew in a slow breath, then released it. "You speak as if courage is a matter of will." "It's a matter of love," he said. Her eyes searched his, and for the first time, she did not try to hide what she felt. She reached up, slowly, and rested her hand lightly against his chest. His hand found hers, fingers interlacing with a kind of reverence, not desperation. Neither moved to kiss. It was not yet time. But in that quiet, sunlit room, something shifted. Not a promise, not a plea, but the slow, certain breaking of a wall built too high for too long. Later, when dusk cooled the air and the first stars blinked out above the orchard, Josepha sat beside the cradle, watching Rian's chest rise and fall. The child had curled himself around one of her shawls, his dark curls damp with sleep. Ziven lingered in the doorway, hesitant. "Frau Engel left bread cooling by the stove," he said. "There's cheese too. Not much, but enough." Josepha looked up at him. "Will you stay a while?" He crossed the room and lowered himself beside her, careful not to disturb the cradle. "Have you ever held him?" she asked. He shook his head. She reached in and lifted the boy gently, placing him in Ziven's arms. The child stirred, then settled again. "He knows your voice," she said. "I think he's always known." Ziven held Rian with the unguarded tenderness of a man who had never expected to be trusted with anything so small. He glanced at Josepha, who rested her head lightly against his shoulder. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. In that fragile moment, surrounded by shadows and warmth, they were not a guard, and an empress only a man, a woman, and the child they had chosen to protect in defiance of all they had been told was possible. The forest path beyond the orchard had turned soft with spring thaw, and the cart wheels sank slightly deeper each time Ziven returned with supplies from the village 3 hours east. Josepha had never accompanied him. It was too soon, too dangerous. Her name still echoed in court dispatches and market whispers, and any unfamiliar face in a rural tavern could carry news back toward Vienna. But that morning, as she watched him adjust the reins and tuck a wrapped loaf beneath the seat, she said, "Take me next time." Ziven didn't look up. "It's not a question of whether you can. It's whether we should. I know how to listen without being heard," she said. Ziven tied off the rope and turned toward her. "You've never had to disappear into a crowd. It's not only about what you say. It's how you move. The way you let silence settle around you. I've been watched all my life," she said. "I learned early how to leave no trace." He weighed her words, then reached into the cart and pulled out a slate gray shawl, worn but clean. "Then you'll need this." That evening, after Rian had gone down in Frau Engel's room with a linen rabbit tucked under his arm, Josepha stood at the basin in the kitchen, twisting water from her hair with a cloth. Ziven sat nearby, carving a spoon from ashwood, the floor between them scattered with curls of pale shavings. "You knew a blacksmith once," she said, turning from the window. "Before you joined the palace guard." He nodded. "In Znajmo. He taught me how to temper iron and red weather by the way birds land." "Did you leave anyone behind?" Ziven's hands paused over the spoon. "A sister. She married into a family that runs a vineyard. We ride on the feast of St. Florian each year. Nothing more." Josepha leaned against the counter, still drying her hands. "You never wanted to return?" "I did," he said. "But I knew I'd only bring trouble if I came back with stories I wasn't allowed to tell." She crossed the small space between them and picked up one of the shavings, turning it between her fingers. "You've given up more than I realized." "I've chosen differently than most," he said. "That's not the same." The room held a quiet that was not heavy, only full. Josepha sat across from him, resting her hands in her lap. "There was a man once," she said. "A baron's son. We were 16. He taught me how to cheat at chess, and spoke with his mouth full." She smiled faintly. "He thought he would marry me." Ziven's eyes met hers. "And did you want that?" "I wanted to believe there was a world where I could choose." Her voice thinned, not from regret, but from memory. "But I knew even then it wasn't mine to imagine." She reached across the table, not grasping, only letting her fingertips rest near his. "I'm still learning how to want something when no one has told me I may." Ziven set down the carving blade and placed his hand over hers. Then let this be your first permission. Later, when moonlight filtered through the kitchen shutters and Rian stirred once in his sleep, Josepha stood at the threshold to her room, her cloak still wrapped around her. Will you stay for a while? She asked. Ziven hesitated. Are you certain? I'd rather not be alone tonight, she said. Not for any reason, but the simplest one. He stepped inside. They sat by the hearth, wrapped in silence and the faint scent of lavender that lingered in the room's corners. She offered him a folded blanket, then sat beside him on the floor, her knees drawn up, her shoulder brushing his. I used to dream of escape, she said. Now I dream of mornings. Ziven looked at her, not with urgency, but with a quiet reverence. Then we'll build toward morning. They didn't speak again that night. When sleep took them, it was in the hush of shared warmth, the fire's glow casting long shadows that neither feared. Outside, the wind had stilled, and in the cradle down the hall, Rian sighed once and turned his face toward the quiet.